All right, welcome everybody. This is OC Product, our fourth webinar in this series of product foundations. I'm Greg White, the founder of OC Product. We are the local product management community in Orange County. I see most of the attendees that are in the webinar right now are actually part of our Southern California community for the most part. I'm Greg White, the founder, and I'm joined by Cosette Dwyer, who's one of our board members. And today we have Janna Bastow, who is the founder of ProdPad, the founder of Mind the Product, and the inventor of the Now Next Later roadmap format. And she's going to talk to us about connecting product work to business outcomes. So with that, I will hand it over to Janna.
Hey, thanks so much for having me here. Good to see everybody here. Nice to see some faces or some names that I know, and some new folks as well. As Greg said, I'm here to talk about connecting product work to business outcomes. He gave me a great intro already. So you know me as the founder of ProdPad. You know me as the inventor of the Now Next Later roadmap, one of the founders of Mind the Product. And so I talk a lot about Now Next Later road mapping. I talk a lot about connecting strategy to outcomes. And today I'm going to be talking about making sure that the product work you do is connected to business outcomes and tackling some of the ongoing decisions and trade-offs that often keep you disconnected from that. And so, you know, our jobs as product people basically boil down to like professional decision maker, right? You're surrounded by thousands of inputs. You've got feedback and user behavior and goals and objectives, and you know, you've got your existing tech, your competitive landscape, you've got your team capabilities, all different sorts of constraints and inputs. And your job is to make the call on what's the number one thing that you need to build over any number of other things, right? You've got to make the call to get there. And it's basically the gig. And so it's really important that this is not a talk about prioritization, right? So I'm not going to be talking about, you know, some 2x2 matrix and send you on the way. You know, I'm going to be talking about what actually happens in product teams when decisions are made under pressure and why those decisions stack up to something much more expensive than anybody intended, how that connects to the outcome work that you're actually looking to do. Now, the thing is that I've been seeing product teams for 10 plus years, coming up 20 years now, across my work with ProdPad, Mind the Product, consulting, and product work before that. And you know what? Something that I've seen over and over again is that teams argue because they're unsure. They stall because they want uncertainty. They over-document because they're afraid to be wrong. And prioritization frameworks don't fail because they're bad. They fail because they give you pretend confidence that comes from like this math that you put behind them. And the thing is, you've seen this time and time again, you can score everything with rice and still not know what to do next, because the real problem was never the scoring and the ranking. It was that nobody really feels confident enough to commit and know that they are working towards the right thing. So I've heard some bad advice over the years, and I actually want to air this stuff and make sure that you know that this is bad advice and that you can ignore it, because I took this stuff on board and then got really confused and couldn't figure out what to do with it. So, for example, have you ever heard somebody say, in order to figure out what to do next, sort into urgent and important, right? Rank things by urgent and important, and these two things are different. But the thing is that this falls apart in practice because urgency and importance are contextual, and they depend on who you are and where in the business you sit. You know, cross-domain comparison is where this sort of collapses. You can't objectively rank a customer retention problem and a technical scaling problem and a competitive positioning problem and a personal problem on the same axis, right? They are all different types of problems that need to be looked at more holistically. And so people who sort of, you know, pretend that you can just sort of put things in neat urgent versus important axis and that'll help you decide. You know, it often makes people feel stupid because they're not seeing it clearly. But actually, I find that this is less helpful than really just thinking more holistically about the problems that you have and how they tie back to those business outcomes. And the other piece of advice that I've heard is to get clarity before action, right? Get all the information before you make a move. and sounds cool, right? But if you are waiting for clarity, if you're waiting for that information, you're going to be waiting forever. You are in this role as a product person because you can make decisions without perfect data. Like that's the value of having a good product person. And like even if AI crunches all the data for you, someone still has to stand behind the decision. That accountability doesn't disappear. And so, really important to remember that it's not about getting all the clarity before action. It's about looking at that wider picture and building up enough confidence that you can make a clear, informed decision before moving, a defensible decision, but not necessarily trying to sit back and get all the information. So, what are some of the reasons why decisions stall on your team? I want to ask you to ask yourself. I want you to ask yourself this, as in, what actually stalls decisions on your team? When I put this to product people, I tend to get a handful of answers. Like the most common by far is that you end up with too many stakeholders, right? Too many people in the room, nobody willing to commit. And every person in the room roughly halves the chance of getting a decision through to the table. Because everyone has veto power, no one has any decision power. The second reason why teams tend to be stalling is that they're not getting enough data to feel confident. And this is the clarity trap. The bar for enough keeps moving, right? You don't need to get all the information, but it becomes this trap where you just need one more research round, one more customer call, right? You just need another sprint to look at the analytics. And in the meantime, that window on being able to make a decision that actually moves you forward closes, right? You're never going to have enough data, but you should be able to pull together enough to make a bet. And the third that we see is that there's this fear of making the wrong call, right? It's a culture thing, right? This decision confidence is often tied to how safe the team feels with making mistakes. Teams stall because no one wants to be the one who gets it wrong. So it's not about ranking the options. It's about being the one ready to be held accountable or to put their name to a particular decision. And the fourth is often just unclear ownership, right? If no one knows whose call it is, then the decision gets made by default, right? Because that's the way that things have always been done, or whoever's loudest, whatever is available to be done by the deadline. This is one of the sneakiest ways that debt creeps in. And actually going to be talking a little bit more about debt, not just tech debt, but other sorts of debt and how they play out with your ability to make decisions that leads to clear business or good business outcomes. And the thing is, none of these are going to be fixed by some framework, right? I'm not going to be sharing some perfect prioritization framework that replaces all this. I want to talk about how we reframe our thinking and how we help shape our team's thinking around things so that we can get to the point where we can make decisions that lead to good business outcomes. And, our world is filled with decisions, right? Building a product is like this multi-dimensional problem. It can't be done without making trade-offs. The same way you can't get through life without making trade-offs. Every time you say yes to something, you're saying no to something else, even if you don't say it out loud. And every trade you make has a cost, right? Everything that you give up on has some sort of cost somewhere else. And sometimes that cost is obvious and immediate, right? We know that if we try to get this out faster, we're not going to be able to build it to the full scope or quality that we're hoping to. And sometimes it's quiet and cumulative, right? No one's actually saying that they're making these trade-offs, but they're happening. And that cumulative cost is where tech debt comes from and other types of debt as well. I'm going to talk a bit about debt because debt is an enabler, right? It's not inherently bad. You can't get through life without going into some sort of debt, right? A mortgage and an education and a car, they're all things that you um, you know, often end up in debt for, but you could try to save up enough cash ahead of time, but you'd be dead before you saved enough, right? You need to be able to use debt as an enabler to get you to the thing that will allow you to unlock more for yourself down the line. And the same with products, right? Like you could try to get everybody on board with building and launching the perfect product, allowing no debt before it goes out the door, all the things that you think this product is going to need to serve the market. But by the time you actually got your perfect product out the door, you'd be obsolete, right? Somebody would have built a good enough version faster than you. So debt actually enables you to move, There's a real question as to whether you're taking it on deliberately or accidentally, whether it's something that you're cognizant of and talking about, or something that's just being hidden behind things. And so you actually might be familiar with the iron triangle of project management: time, cost, scope, and if you sort of squeeze any of these, you squeeze out quality, right? And for any one of these to give, you've got to be willing to give on another front, right? We rarely have magic spare budget or all the time in the world, so time or cost is often flexed in exchange for scope or quality. Right? This is exactly what we're doing when we run experiments using like quick prototypes and MVPs. We're trading off perfect quality or full scope in order to gain back time and cost, to get it out faster and cheaper. And that's actually healthy debt. Most cases, right? But it's not sustainable forever, right? You can't just constantly build the slightly lower spec version over and over and over again, the slightly lower quality version, and hope that you never run into quality problems. There have got to be other places where you recognize this debt and pay it off, right? You do maintenance work as well. You've heard of the whole thing of good, fast, cheap, pick two. It exists for a reason, right? So you've got to balance these out. And most importantly, it's important to understand whether the debt that you're getting your team into, this product debt, is intentional or it's unintentional, right? If it's intentional, the team agrees that they're taking a shortcut, knowing that they'll come back to fix it. There's a shared understanding about what's at stake and how the debt's going to be measured and managed. They're having the conversation around it. The really dangerous kind is unintentional. It comes from not having those conversations. When you skip the bit where you actually say to the team, like, we understand that this is a trade-off we're making, and here's how we're going to deal with it later. This trade-off is enabling us to do this, and therefore this is the value of doing so. Unintentional debt, it often comes from beyond the team's control, right? It comes from deadlines, as in fixed time, from pressures to change scope or deliver something that it doesn't line up with that iron triangle. It often comes from decisions that weren't actually talked about. They weren't explicitly framed as trade-offs. And actually, one of the biggest bringers of this debt is deadlines. So as the creator of the Now Next Later roadmap, I've got something against deadlines. And the thing is, deadlines are sometimes necessary, right? I'm not saying we should never work with them, but having something like a Gantt chart, a timeline roadmap, is basically a tech debt collection pot. Right? Your bosses and customers love when it gives them that certainty, but it's setting your team up for failure because you've always got this timeline at the top, and everything you put on the roadmap, everything includes a deadline. And there's this vicious cycle that kicks in. If you've ever heard of Parkinson's law is the one that states that work expands to fill the time allotted. And so if you say something's going to take a month, then it will take a month, even if your original estimate said 2 weeks. People will take that long to do so because scope creeps and procrastination happens, deadline crunches happen, and all of a sudden you end up with all these different deadlines, one stacked on top of the other. One deadline is probably fine. Multiple stacked as dependencies on top of each other is where you end up with these crunches, and the team stops making informed trade-offs. Instead, they're simply making decisions based on what they can get out the door. And that means cutting scope or quality. And this is the real damage that's being done, right? Underneath the surface, even the product manager sometimes doesn't realize, it's code that could have been more elegantly built, comments and documentation left by the wayside. In this day and age, it's, AI code and AI artifacts that are put out there that aren't fully checked and remedied, right? All these things that could have been done that little bit better, but you know what? It got it out the door in time so that you can start working on the next thing that's due. And so the release might look fine, but everything you build is just that little bit subpar. It's building up that debt. And of course, this is what phase 2 is for. But everyone knows the biggest lie in software is phase 2, right? It's the biggest lie your roadmap ever told. That list of things that you go back and fix. And so it's really important to, think about the work that's being done in order to, or the decisions and the conversations that are being had around the work that's being done to make sure that you're not stacking up this debt. Or if you are, you're having conversations around it and have an agreement as to how you're going to handle it. This new work can get prioritized and can get championed in the right way to solve these debt problems. And the thing is that you're going to be making a lot of decisions, but most decisions are reversible or low stakes, right? A lot of times they feel scarier than they are, but actually, the cost of reversal is often lower than we estimate when we're looking over the precipice of making a call on something. You know, the other thing that you should consider is the fact that the speed of decision matters, right? So making 100 decisions, and these are just guesses here, 100 decisions that are 50% good versus 30 decisions that are 70% good. The faster team learns more and corrects themselves faster. They get more out there, right? And so this is why buying should usually beat building. Those build versus buy decisions. We're often looking at in terms of saying, well, actually, you know what, we could build this ourselves. That's a really seductive direction, especially now in the days of AI. But I think we're starting to see that even with the power to build everything, it doesn't mean that we're actually getting to the value that we're getting out of those build decisions faster. Buy is one of those decisions that actually just reduces the stakes so much that it makes it easier to run and make faster decisions in that direction. But of course, every decision needs to be weighed up for itself, right? And this is the job, isn't it? Now I talk about playing fast and loose, making decisions. Very important caveat: I don't want to see anybody playing fast and loose with safety or ethics, right? Obviously, we want to make sure that we're considering decisions that are reversible and aren't creating harm. Now, it's not just tech debt that I'm talking about. There's other types of debt that are slowing us down from being able to make these to reach these business outcomes. So, has anybody heard of any of these other types of debt? So obviously, we've all spent lots of time talking about tech debt. Anybody familiar with design debt or process debt, discovery debt, roadmap debt, culture debt? I'm going to walk through and just give a little bit of detail on each one. Obviously, tech debt is the one that we talk about a lot, right? So it's bugs in the code, right? It's the lack of quality that's built in as we rush things out the door. And it accumulates, right? So you end up with a product that over time needs to be entirely rewritten because it started off with a few bugs and those bugs started accumulating. They were never fixed, and it gets harder and harder to go back and fix those. So tech debt is like the cost of reworking existing parts of your product that were supposed to be built in a good way, but instead were done in a hasty or subpar way instead of that full and ideal solution. It's the reality of your product's life. Another one is design debt. Design debt it shows up in those limitations that are built in, right? It's not a bug, but it's a feature, right? It's something that was designed that way because no one was really thinking about that fuller flow. They're those really freaky UX bugs, those awkward bits of the flow where you sort of go, well, is this a bug? Because it doesn't necessarily not work, but it certainly doesn't help the user get to that point of solving the problems. It's slowing them down from hitting that point. And this is from teams who are rushing through the design point, right? They aren't really thinking about that UX flow. They're not thinking about how users are going to go from the point of discovery of your product through to solving the problem that job's to be done. And so it often comes from things like, the MVP, it's good enough. Let's move on to the next thing. It's bug free, whatever, keep going, right? And actually, I can see Scott in the chat sharing other debts as well. So I'm sure there's more we could dive into this as well. I'm going to read that article later. Thanks, Scott. Another one that I keep an eye on is, when you've got tech and design debt stacking up, your processes start compensating, right? So if your app becomes too hard to use, then support bears the burden, right? If your tech is not up to scratch, then you end up with shaky automations and manual workarounds and AI hacked agents doing whatever instead of solid infrastructure. Um, it's the type of thing where somebody says, let's just add a step to the workflow for now. We don't need to automate this. We don't need an actual playbook for this. And actually, this might be perfectly appropriate, especially when you're early stage in learning. But if they're left untended, they can become quite costly. Another one to keep an eye on is the discovery debt. It's what happens when you skip the learning step, right? So every feature you build without validating the problem is a bet, right? And sometimes you win, sometimes you build features that people want. But actually, we know this, we all do this. We build features that we didn't get enough discovery work on. We didn't test our assumptions. We didn't fully understand the problem space. And these are the types of things that end up sitting in your product forever because, sure, they solve the flow for somebody, that one off user or whoever it is who crafted the flow, but they don't solve the problem for the wider market. They don't technically don't work. They're not bugs, right? They're not friction points in the UX, but they're not actually helping your customers or your end users solve their problems with your product. They're not quite right, but they're not quite wrong, and they silently end up creating this friction downstream. Again, it comes from timeline constraints. We oftentimes things like discovery work are not seen as work, and therefore, when your stakeholder wants it by next quarter, they want to see the code going out the door. They want to see the designs being put together. They want to see it shipped. And oftentimes, the easiest thing to skip is the discovery part, even though it compounds, right? You skip discovery, you end up with more subsequent decisions being built on assumptions from upstream that were never fully tested. And that piles downstream and ends up with a product that solves problems and less, and reaches those outcomes less and less. And so roadmap debt, this is more of like a strategic level thing, right? Roadmap debt is what accumulates when you defer these hard conversations. When there's three things that should be number one priority and no one's willing to say which one wins, right? This is when your roadmap is filled with all the things you could do, right? I've seen it this way where your vision is all encompassing and everyone can see their version of the vision in the roadmap and in the vision document and things like that in the strategy documents. But when you actually look at it, no one can really agree on what order they need to tackle in order to get to that vision. And that's where your roadmap should be creating that clarity. But if your roadmap is actually just a big pile of stuff, a handful of things happening now, 30 things happening next and 40 things happening later, then everyone goes, sure, my thing is on there. Check, let's go. When actually it's not forcing you to make those decisions about what are you actually going to be tackling in what order in order to get you to that vision fastest, to get you to the best version of that strategy that you're putting out there. And when all these other ones go unchecked, they spill over into culture debt. This is the cognitive dissonance that your team feels when they know they're being dragged down by debt and short-term thinking, but the incentives that they're being run by incentivizes them for shipping more, not shipping well. And so it 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 comes from teams who are used to being incentivized for output over outcomes, measuring teams as cost centers, right? How many story points did this team do? How many lines of code can this group of agents and coders put out there? Pitting divisions against each other with competing metrics. You have a developer advocating for getting a quality version out and a business person pushing for speed. They're not fighting tensions. They're disagreeing because the system is both asking them to work counter incentives. And so what's missing is often this shared vocabulary and trust where they can talk about the trade-offs honestly. Why do we need to have it done by this deadline? Why does it need to be this level of quality before we go out? Both could have very good points, and the right answer is probably somewhere in between those two. And it's by having the ability to talk about trade-offs and the debt that's being accumulated, the downstream impacts on the business outcomes, the business viability. It's having these conversations everywhere from your developers through to your sales team and everybody in between, talking about why certain things can be done in certain ways, allows them to find that middle ground, to see that middle ground. Otherwise, it tends to just default to, well, whoever is most incentivized in the company. Is it a product-led company? Is it a sales-led company? Is it engineering-led company? That usually helps break the tie, and not always in a good way. And with any kind of debt, all these types of debt compound, right? So, if you have too much tech debt, too many bugs, it often starts stacking up into design debt and process debt. Process debt creates culture debt, right? Skipping discovery creates all of the above. And basically, your team ends up dealing with, as your team is dealing with all this added debt, it gives them less capacity for really thinking clearly about what's going to prevent future debt and what they do about this existing debt. So it's this compounding cycle, and it starts with individual decisions that felt reasonable at the time, little tiny trade-offs, but that they weren't talked about in the grand scheme of how they are going to impact the business. Right. So just to just a gut check for yourselves. I want to see anybody in the chat here. How intentional is your team's debt? Do your teams talk about this? Do you talk about trade-offs? Do you talk about things across different divisions about how what one team might do might impact the other, or how a decision on moving more quickly or slowing something down is going to impact another area of the business? Or is this something that is newer territory in terms of your team's vocabulary? All right, I'm going to stop and take a breather, because that was the diagnosis. I can see Paul has jumped in here to say all the time, great, makes it part of their development time, right? So that's actually really key to be happening. I know not everybody says that. I speak to teams all the time who they don't talk about this stuff. So that's why I'm talking about this stuff here today. So this talk is not, I'm not here to tell you about how to eliminate debt, how to make perfect decisions, how to, you know, fix all your problems. It's about making this stuff more visible. It's making it more intentional and making it more manageable. So some of the things that help set the stage. One of the most effective things you can be doing is to decide the big things up front, right? I mean, we all know if everyone's on the same page with the same vision, you're all pointing in the same direction, right? You're all singing from the same hymn sheet.
My big rocks.
There
in
you
my
go. Get your big rocks sorted first, and then the small rocks in the sand fall in between, right? And actually, I've seen it this way, right? Which is thinking about the vision, right? The vision could be anything, but actually it shouldn't be anything, right? It should narrow the universe in which people are looking out there, right? Having objectives, clear objectives as to what's important for the business narrows the options, right? Because otherwise anybody could be going in the right direction. Anything you decide could be the right thing. And principles are really key as well, right? So principles are the sort of thing that they break the tie or they narrow the debate, right? If you are uh, um, uh, uh, if you're setting principles that help guide the team between decisions, it means that they can make those decisions without you as a leader or a product person breathing down their necks, guiding those decisions. It allows the teams to make decisions on their own. And these are decisions around trade-offs, for example, like Spotify had a really good set of principles that were around, it was speed of getting the music to come out really quickly, right? So that buffer time had to be minimized. Everything at the mercy of making sure that things went out fast, right? Other teams have different principles that break the tie? Is it that you are focusing on your end users or your buyer users? Is it that you are for this side of the marketplace or this side? And obviously it's both, but oftentimes being able to outline up front what your principles are as a business can help you break the tie between, well, do we cater for this type of user, this.
Okay, so I don't know how long you're going to be frozen, but yeah, so um, those key bets, I have a principle of protecting your yes. And I encourage organizations to have one, two, maybe three key bets that they are focused on. And what are those things that we're doing everything around? And those other ideas of it's coming down to those principles. These are the things that we're working on. This is the customer segment that we're focusing on. And if there's an opportunity that comes along for another customer segment that is not part of our area of focus, that needs to be considered against the principle that we've previously set.
Mhm.
Narrows
Yeah,
the argument.
yeah, that's a really good one. And Pete asked in the chat, what happens when leadership doesn't buy into moving fast and accruing intentional debt? And actually, we see this often, right? And this is where you end up with teams who they will call it their MVP, but actually, their MVP seems to be identical to what they envision the bigger picture product is going to be. And so they, because they're not willing to talk about the awkwardness of, actually we're willing to ship something that isn't quite right, or we're not willing to ship something that's not quite right. Right, both are valid answers depending on the context in which that company operates, right? Your competitive nature, the regulatory world that you're in, how important your data is, all that sort of stuff. But if the design team thinks that you're going for an MVP and the sales team thinks that they're going to be able to sell this thing for full whack day one, that's a mismatch. And oftentimes they won't even talk about it. They'll just say, yeah, it's the MVP, and have different ideas as to what that actually means. So you've got to make those trade-offs explicit, right? You've got to name it out loud. You've got to, basically say things like, we're choosing to ship this without the edge case handling here because we want to learn whether users even want this feature. We're accepting this debt because if it takes off, we know we can come back and build a more robust version. Or it's that saying, actually, you know what, this is a really critical area. We already have proof that this is the right area because X, Y, Z. We need to hit parity with X, and we know that it has to be good for day one, which means we're going to be willing to put in more time and effort and everything to get it right. And that's why we're moving more slowly, but it's going to be better when we get it out. Could be valid response as well. Both are valid. It just needs to be said out loud so that the team can actually frame it properly for themselves. And Scott has a good point in the chat here. He says he says he facilitates it. He frames it as the risk of being wrong versus the risk of being late, and allowing leaders to choose, and not just allowing leaders to choose, but allowing the team to choose. Right. So once that decision has been made as to which one is more important, it allows the rest of the team to act more quickly in the direction that's aligned with what hopefully the rest of the team is on board with. So, one of my favorite tools has become this decision log. Right now, you're probably already doing lots of decisions, and but unless you're writing them down, you're not going to remember why certain things were at stake, and what you were meant to learn from it. So, having a decision log, something to basically say, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we think we're going to learn from it, this is what we need to do, here's where this decision sits, here's how we're going to quantify it, here's how we know it's going to work, or here's how we know it's going to make the right decision. And one of